Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 309 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. I am the Orange Tank, your host, Neelan, and with me are the red and green tanks, Kellen and Mark. How are you both doing?
Doing good.
How are you both doing?
Fired up.
Both doing good.
I need to express more empathy, is what I've been told by a therapist.
Uh-huh.
So, how are you both?
Oh, that's so kind of you to ask, Kellen. Thank you. I'm doing great. Thank you.
I feel like this is going to be a whole new show for me going forward, if that's the case.
Awesome to hear.
The empathy is just coming through.
Yeah, it's like radiating off of you.
And that's just audio, right? If
I
people
know,
could
imagine
see.
with a video component. Yeah, if you could just see how much Kellen's face is like buzzing with empathy now.
He almost has his eyes wide open.
The biggest smile. Wow, it's magical. Okay, this week on the show, we had a couple of questions from listeners that we thought were very intriguing. Some involving maybe a little bit of less is more and funerals.
Death.
And as a reminder, if you want to send a topic suggestion to us for a future episode, you can do that at boardgamebarrage.com/topics. Before we get there, though, we're going to be talking about some of the games that we've been playing. And this week, Kellen has been playing Keydom's Dragons. I've been playing Sagrada Artisans, and Mark's going to tell us about Hegemony, Lead Your Class to Victory. We're going to start it off with Kellen. Tell us about Keydom's Dragons.
All right, first of all, empathy doesn't extend to like loving every game that we play, correct?
That's fair. Is that like a preemptive warning?
It's not a preemptive warning, but the name Keydom's Dragons is about as bad as it can get, which is to say that this is a re-implementation of a game called Aladdin's Dragons, but the designer, Richard Breese, has made so many amazing Key games that it's like, hey, wait a minute, let's retroactively add this to the Key series by calling it Keydom's Dragons, which makes me want to die. So let's just start there. But also, Mark, have you played Aladdin? I know Neelan, I'm directing it at you because Neelan played Keydom's Dragons with me. Have you played Aladdin's Dragons?
I have played Aladdin's Dragons, yeah.
Great. And it's also, Aladdin's Dragons is a reimplementation of a game, Keydom, which arguably, and, you know, we have often cited Bus as the first worker placement game, but depending on who you ask, it's actually this game, Keydom, and it's very...
Wait, I'm so confused. I don't think I realized this part. So this was a game that he had already had in the Keydom series, that he re-implemented as a game not in the Keydom series, and then re-implemented back as a Keydom game?
That's right. But I think Keydom is a little bit of a different game. I think Keydom's Dragons is a strict, like, almost one-to-one of Aladdin's Dragons, which is a redo of a game called Keydom.
I see.
The really interesting thing here is how much of this design, like, has Kalis in it as well, which I think this predates Kalis, which is sort of like the thrust of this is that you are competing to get the most artifacts in the game, and you are placing workers out on a board that has sort of narrative journey where you start with the dragons, you're collecting the gems, and so you're placing all of your workers out, and then they all go off sort of up this road. So you start with the dragons, and then you resolve who has placed workers there. You start, and you go up through the town, and everybody gets little abilities, and then you get to the artifact room, and you hope that you're able to collect artifacts. What I will say is that the worker placement itself, might defy some modern descriptions of worker placement, because what you're doing is you have a set of workers numbered 1 through 8, I believe, and you are placing them face down on any location. So if you want the yellow dragon's treasure, you place your face down 4 on it, but Neelan then goes, I wanted the yellow dragon's treasure, and so he puts his face down 5. And then we get into essentially an auction bidding war that is blind, where we're putting stuff down on top of that space, and then once everybody runs out of all their tokens, if you have the only token there, you're going to get the benefit of that spot, but otherwise you're adding up all of the numbers, which makes for a really funny, tense situations where you don't know if someone is just completely bluffing you. It strikes me as a mechanism on the face of it that would just not be done one-to-one in 2024 because of the amount of LOL that exists in it in the best possible way. Let me reiterate that. The best possible way. This combines with other systems whereby to even get the artifacts, and artifacts are the victory points, you have to make it through this chokehold or the castle door. And the castle door is a 1 through 10 random number that you don't know, and you have to use your workers to bid on it. So if you bid with your 5, you're just desperately hoping that that's somewhere around that number, but it's just randomly resolved and shown to you when you get to the castle. So it's sort of like you make all these plans, you're fighting Nealon here, you're fighting Christina over there, and then you get up to the castle door and you flip over a 10 and it's like, you're not getting any artifacts this round. And all the people that you've bid on the artifacts past the castle gates get you nothing. Then, in addition to that, there are spell cards that are just like completely would not be designed in the year 2024 because they're just like, oh, you get this special power. Everyone else get and they're amazing, and they can be blocked like Cosmic Encounter style with like cancel artifacts. Each artifact that you acquire also has a special power attached to it. I will say that my description of this, I think, does defy how much I actually enjoyed playing Keydom's Dragons and how much I want to play it again. We played it as a 4-player game. Nealon, what was your take on Keydom's Dragons?
I liked it. I liked it quite a bit. I think that there is something very delightful about blind bidding in general, and especially the way that this does it, where you do all of your blind bids and then only reveal them in sequence, I think is just a great gradual reveal. This didn't really happen all that much in our game, but I think I can easily see where this could be incredibly punitive just based on how things might resolve, right? Where like you said, that situation where someone flips over the guard and it's a 9 guard, say, and then everyone's tokens after that point, that didn't really come up all that much. I think the reveals on the guards were always low enough that you could either pay your way through them or we just had appropriately bid. But like I can see that being a pain, for example. I do love the simplicity of just number of artifacts, which is a very small number by the end. I think the winning score was 6, just being the victory condition. It's a very simple victory condition, which I think is lovely to build your whole game around. It's like, okay, all of this is great. This is how you're going to be getting your gems. This is how you'll be getting your first player marker. This is how you're going to be getting cards. But all that matters is getting these artifacts at the end. And I think that's a great base to build the game around. And I thought it mostly worked very well. Like the cards can be pretty like take that-y to be, I guess, as derisive as possible. But you have to be okay with that because that's just kind of the sort of the nature of the game.
Yeah, I think one thing I forgot to mention, too, is that in the artifact rooms, which are past the castle gates, past the dragons, past the marketplace where you're getting all your stuff, the more you bid on those locations in order to secure them, the higher cost it will be to acquire an artifact. So you can actually bid yourself up to where you can't even afford to get the artifact, and you're just hoping that you can on the way there, which I also found really, really fun because you can't just slam down all your best workers up there to ensure that you get that artifact. Like nothing is locked or confirmed. I would say that I think this game will work really well for medium to heavy gamers who are willing to play it fast and loose. Yeah. Like if you approach this like a Euro strategy game, you are going to hate so many of the gotchas of it. But if turns are snappy and people are just throwing out their workers and then going, curse you, Nealon, you shouldn't have gone there. Like I wanted the first player marker this turn. Like what a lovely affair. Mark, You have played Aladdin's Dragons. How long ago was it and what was your recollection?
Spare you that.
1998, right?
No, it was certainly not that long ago. It was within the last 3 or 4 years. It was since my move to Vegas. I've played it here. I know that. That said, I don't remember the details. I just looked over pictures of Keydom's Dragons, and there's quite a similarity for sure in terms of at least how the board is laid out. I remember liking it and thinking that it had sharp elbows in a way that a lot of older games do. And your advice is how I sort of came away thinking about it. I played with one person who wants to play games where you calculate and doesn't like luck messing things up, and then another person who's more fast and loose, and unsurprisingly the fast and loose player really liked it. In fact, they're the person who brought the game, and the calculating player bounced off the moments where they were punished. And I don't remember, again, the game very clearly, but I do remember that it can be pretty punitive if things go against you, and they didn't like that. I remember that much about it. I remember myself coming away from it, enjoying it, but not really being enthralled. It was a game that I had on my want in trade list, and I think some point afterwards I took it off that, just because, not because it's a bad game, but I didn't, again, find myself itching to necessarily play it over and over again. It might have been the group, it might have been the circumstance. And again, I did like it, but just thought it was like, okay.
Yeah, I think it's at least doesn't feel like the modern sort of Euro type game that's coming
refreshing
out.
that way.
Yeah. And it reminded me a little bit of when I played, and you guys still haven't played, Beowulf the Legend, where it's just like there are parts of it that are just dumb, but like the experience of playing it is hilarious and just like you're there for it. Again, I do wonder, and my big asterisk there, if that's like sort of this I've played 1,000 games now syndrome, and it's like I'm okay with it just being completely stupid as long as I'm like, no, it's stupid. And again, this game is not stupid, and it's like a beloved family weight game for many people in the hobby who still talk about Aladdin's Dragons. It's fun to see the origins of some of the Kalis and the worker placement and sort of moving up this. I don't really know where this fits or if it'll stick around in my collection, but I'm like really glad we got to play it and would like to bust it out at a higher player count to just goof with the like excess of how stupid it could get at 6. But that is Keydom's Dragons. I don't know if it's one of the first games from Richard Breese, but at least Keydom probably was. Yeah. It's cool. It's cool to go back. I'm doing a mark. I'm pulling a mark. Except I'll only do it if it's redone with dragons in a newer edition that's shiny. You know what I mean?
Right.
All new are only for me.
So at this point, I have played through most of a campaign of Sagrada Artisans, and I have a lot of very strong feelings, as does everyone that I'm playing with this with. For those that don't know, Sagrada is a lovely game of dice drafting where you have a window that you're trying to fill out, a stained glass window. You're picking a die from a set, you snake draft dice, and you cannot place a die of the same color or number next to each other. And you're sort of trying to fill out your grid as completely as possible with objectives that you're scoring along the way. That's a very simple core design. It has a lovely sort of family weight elegance to it, like something like a Splendor does. It also has that lovely tactile nature. Splendor, Azul, I kind of think of Sagrada kind of all in the same class of game. Sagrada Artisans is a recent legacy version of this, where a lot of those details have changed and I think gotten a lot worse in the process. So the core game is still the same. You are still effectively drafting dice, effectively drawing them placing them onto your grid, but you're not actually placing the dice onto your grid anymore. Now what it has been replaced by are coloring books, effectively, where you have a page and colored pencils, and when you draft a purple die, for example, you're then writing in a 2 and then coloring in that space purple, which is a lovely idea. I think everything about that sounds great. There's a very doodly, cathartic nature in it to me, where you're kind of just like scribbling on your page in between turns. They've done the smart thing of making lots of little spaces to color in while you're waiting for other people's turns to roll around. So if you want a coloring book while you play a board game, Sagrada Artisans is for you.
Sounds like Helen.
That is everything Helen has ever
Mark.
told me about his taste in board games. Exactly. But some of the decisions along the way here are really, really baffling. And some of these are going to be pretty petty, but I'll start there, which is to say that
First of all, can I just say I'm super excited right now for Nealon's petty things. Love
petty
it.
nitpicks?
Can't wait.
Okay, I kind of hate that I'm starting here because it does feel really nitpicky and petty. But
you may hate it, but I love it.
The one thing that you have to do right if you're going to translate your game to a game about coloring is make sure that the pencil colors feel like they're actually like good pencils that match the colors printed in the page. But no, you end up having like a purple that looks more like a pink that doesn't look anything like the printed purple. So by the time you've finished out your like stained glass window, it just looks like this disgusting mash of like faded light colors. It doesn't look bold. It doesn't look vibrant. And you're changing that from what is this very sort of bold, vibrant colors of these dice on your board. So that just feels like a detail to get wrong. That feels like a bad detail to get wrong. The pencils are terrible. We're breaking constantly. Needed sharpening. The sharpener that they include in the box is garbage. Anyway, these are production
Wait,
issues.
you're complaining there's the pencil sharpener in the box
It's
isn't
bad.
up to
That's
snuff?
just bad.
Fair.
The pencil sharpener in the box?
That is a valid complaint.
As the kids say, let him cook, Kellen.
Anyway, so that aside, let's let that go. The reason I'm bringing that up first because I really just feel like how are these the things you got wrong in your game that's effectively a coloring book? But anyway, the stuff that I found mostly frustrating along the way is kind of the same stuff that I think a lot of legacy games get wrong, which is they get lost in the weeds of like glomming stuff onto the game. And by the time you get to around game 5 or 6, you now have so many different mechanics and systems that you're trying to remember how they work and keep track of that it does just become an exercise in tedium. There's enough time passing between sessions of playing this that I would constantly sort of have to read up through our, intensely sticker-booked rule book to figure out all the mechanics we have in play, how any of those work. We would often get to the end of the games and players would forget things that should have been saving graces or stuff to replace things like the tools, which you get in base Sagrada, that are like basically little assistant powers, how any of those worked or the stuff that they had access to, or even just the options that they had available. There are so many weird little systems layered into this. So there's like a magic square that you're filling in parallel to the window you're filling out. The one thing I will give this game absolute credit for is the inventiveness of the boards from chapter to chapter are these quite inventive pages. So it very quickly goes from being a 4x4 grid of squares to, this is not exactly going to be great for audio listeners, but I do want to show you just how weird and wonderful some of these pages get. So you're filling out sort of stained glass with dove illustrations that you sort of have to fill out in a circle, and they just get very intricate in ways that are very inventive, and the rules kind of change enough that the specifics of filling out your grid get very interesting. But it just becomes mired in so much stuff that almost every session all of us would just say, do you remember when we used to like playing Sagrada?
Oh my
Because
gosh.
it just really got to the point that we weren't actually enjoying it nearly as much as the base game, which we had played plenty at that point before we started the campaign. So that's just a bummer. You never want your expanded campaign of a game to just feel at every point like a worse experience than playing the original game. So that was pretty frustrating. I don't have a lot of great things to say about the experience of this as a campaign game. Unfortunately, I went in really, really wanting to like it, having a lot of love for Sagrada. So just kind of bummed by this overall.
Did you play the whole thing?
Not yet. We have a couple of games left to go, but I'm not expecting anything magical to happen in the last 2 games of the campaign.
So, you mentioned a game that has coloring books and Legacy where you have to revisit it over and over again. And I get the sense that maybe there is an intention that this game should be played on a lazy Sunday. That's difficult when you have a Legacy game, and presumably you want to get the same group over and over again. But would that have... I don't know how intensely you try to get through the campaign or how intensely you guys are playing. Does that hurt the game? But then, you're saying that the rules get more and more complicated, and I can't see a casual Sunday morning group being interested in a game that gets more and more rules heavy. So I don't know.
Absolutely not. And I can speak to some of that pretty specifically, which is this has actually been playing out over the course of since last year. So a long time at this point.
Yeah.
We're playing it at not a regular frequency, obviously, but not at a cadence where we kind of feel like, okay, we got to push ourselves to play this
right.
every week or every couple of weeks,
Gotcha.
or something like that. And then in answer to your other question, this is a group of players who, are not experienced board gamers. So these are not my colleagues I've spoken about previously. They do not play a lot of board games, but the stuff like Sagrada, the stuff like Azul, they've taken to dramatically well. And I think that the thing that's going to be very telling is that the rules have gotten to the point that I actually am the only one that's able to keep all of them in my head. I think a lot of the time they need to be reminded about stuff that's been added on. That sucks. You don't want the rules of a game to evolve past the point that people that loved it now just literally can't keep it all in their head.
Yeah.
It's one of the worst ways having implemented a legacy game that I have personally experienced, which is a huge bummer.
That sucks.
But that is Sagrada Artisans.
So, 2 weeks ago, I was on the cutting edge in reviewing Kudna Ora, one of the Heavy Game of the Year Golden Geek nominees. Then last week, I shifted back to a review of an older game, London 2nd Edition. And this week, I shift back up to one of the hottest of the hots, not just a Golden Geek nominee for Heavy Game of the Year, but the winner of the award, and the winner of the most innovative game of the year, and the most thematic game of the year. That's right, I played Hegemony, Lead Your Class to Victory, designed by Vangelis Bagiartakis and Varnavas Timotheo, and published by Hegemonic Project Games. Before I dig into this, I just want to shout out Ben Mendelker from the wonderful Game Brain podcast, whose praise of this game, even before the Golden Geek nominations were released, put it on my radar, and who very, very graciously offered to play it with me. And were I still living in LA, I would have been thrilled and honored to do just that. But alas, I'm here in Las Vegas, no longer in LA. Anyway, thanks to you, Ben, for pushing me to finally get this off my shelf. So, in Hegemony, you're playing one of 4 opposing socioeconomic classes of people in a society. There's the working man who's trying to get by and spend the money they earn on health care, education, and luxuries in order to get ahead. There's the capitalist class who are trying to just flat out make the most money they can. There's the middle class who are somewhere in between. They're both working towards prosperity, but also starting up their own small businesses. And then there's the state who needs to try to make everyone happy, basically. And as you might have guessed, this makes for quite an asymmetric game where each player is sort of playing their own game, sort of in pursuit of their own goals. I say and stress the sort of part because there is a bunch of overlap. First, the structure of everyone's game is the same. You start every round with 7 cards, and each turn of the round, you're going to play 1 card out of your hand, either playing it for one of your basic actions or doing whatever the card says, which is usually a buffed up version of those basic actions. I'm not going to go into all the actions now, not because there's necessarily a ton of them, but because each faction has some differences, and it would sort of gum up my ability to review. But basically, that's what everyone's turn consists of mechanically. 7 cards to start a round. Play 1 for a regular action or the card effect, which is usually a plussed up regular action. Do that 5 times, and that ends the round. Again, I won't go into great detail about the actions, except to reiterate, as I kind of hinted at, the fact that there is some overlap between what the players can do. Primarily where you see this the most is the middle class player. The working class is primarily trying to get workers into jobs, trying to get those jobs to be paying as much as possible, even if that means putting on strikes, and then using the money they get from working to add prosperity to their class. The capitalists, as I mentioned, on the other hand, are trying to open businesses, keep wages as low as possible, crank out goods and services, trying to sell them for as much as possible to the overseas market or even to other players. The middle class player is trying to do a little bit of both. They have workers trying to get jobs and maximize their income that way, while also trying to open small shops and selling a little bit here and there. So there's this synergy between all the factions as far as having some sense of what the other players are going after and how they aim to get there. For as interesting as asymmetric games can be, one thing that really bothers me about a lot of them is when you're playing your own game in an asymmetric game to the extent that you don't really know how the other players are interacting with the game or with the board or whatever, and you don't really have a grip as far as what they're trying to do, and more importantly, what you can do to either slow them down or incentivize them to work with you. While the asymmetry in Hegemony is stark, you definitely have a sense of how everyone else's game works. So going back to the game mechanisms and how they differ and overlap between players, there's also this law board where the current state of the legislation is set and altered. This deals with things like the tax rate, the amount of immigration you're allowing, how much healthcare and education is subsidized by the government, minimum wage, stuff like that. And throughout the course of the game, the players can propose bills that are going to be voted on and affect the board state and options and strategies they're all sort of going after. This is probably a good time to talk about the state player, which I haven't mentioned very much of, who's trying to get the laws to line up with their goals. So each state player has a card which will tell you what your goals are in terms of how you want the legislation to look. But you're also, probably more importantly, trying to make it so that each of the different factions is happy by offering aid or benefits while funding yourself through tax collection and occasionally making money from public services. So there's a lot going on in Hegemony. My rules explanation for the game, the first game we played, probably took about 45 minutes, and that first game lasted a little over 3 hours. That said, I really didn't think it was too heavy for experienced gamers. Of course, this is not something you're going to bring casual gamers to, I don't think. And it really didn't have a ton of small, easily forgotten rules or like side clauses or issues like that. It also comes with a comprehensive and often checked in our first game tip sheet, which is tailored for each faction, which really helps streamline what everybody needs to know. And it's a really good reference for players to figure out what they're allowed to do and sort of what they're aiming for. For as big as the player aid is, it's very succinct. Anyway, I really liked Hegemony. The different markets and legal forces were great. They seemed really dynamic and yet clear to grasp and figure out how to manipulate. I really like how the game really lent itself to negotiating, while often making that negotiating a little nuanced. If there's a spectrum with the factions in this game, you've got the working class on one end and the capitalists in the opposition. But it was really interesting to see that sometimes that they would form a coalition against the other players in terms of voting if they needed another player to be slowed down or if it just benefited them for one reason or another in general. At first, after playing and only then realizing that this had won the Innovative Game of the Year, I sort of scoffed at that. Like, I played Hegemony, and then I'm like, oh, actually, I didn't realize that it had won Innovative Game of the Year, and it sort of surprised me. I usually think of innovation as, like, new mechanisms or whatever, and I didn't think there was anything, and I don't think there's anything really like that in Hegemony. But after thinking about it and the way it blends mechanisms, I do think that is pretty novel. The way that the aforementioned, like, dynamic of the economy is both dynamic and easy to understand. I also agree that the game is really thematic. Again, it won Thematic Game of the Year award. As you got the capitalist player, like in our games, the capitalist player is there sitting there counting their money and like has this big load of cash that they're just trying to figure out how to spend. While the working class player has been like griping about the fact that they can barely get by. And then the state player is freaking out about keeping everybody happy while they complain to them. There are clearly hurdles trying to get people to try this game. It's a game about politics, at least in some respect, and that might be a hard sell nowadays. This is also a game that just won Heavy Game of the Year. That might be another turnoff to people. If the former is your concern, know that politics is mainly there to allow for economy and negotiation to be there. Certainly, there isn't like a political philosophy forwarded. Although, again, I don't mean that to say like this is a theme that's painted on to get mechanisms across. It does tie in very well to the theme. If you're worried about the latter, the fact that it was a Heavy Game of the Year, I would say that while that first rules explanation might be on the long side, once you played a round or two of the game, it really gets out of your way more than you might expect. And if you're familiar with medium weight games in general, I don't think Hegemony is going to be too much to handle. So I would strongly recommend Hegemony. I really liked it. Hegemony, Lead Your Class to Victory, designed by Vangelis Bagiartikis and Varnavas Timotheo, and published by Hegemonic Project Games.
I am very, very intrigued by this for a host of reasons. A, it's such a novel theme. I think everything that you've described about it sounds amazing. I am perturbed by the weight for sure, but like It sounds like something that would be at least an experience to play, a couple of times. Like you mentioned doing it the next time we were together at like a Dice Tower West or something. I think that would be the perfect context for it.
I think this is right around a perfect. I'm worried that I'm speaking like without thinking about it, but like pretty much a perfect BGB game.
Yeah,
because it's asymmetric. So in terms of difficulty, to get to your point about like the weight of it, I think that this is an easier game to play probably than Station Fall.
Oh, interesting. That was the other game I had in the back of my head.
Yeah.
As like, okay, would I? Yeah, that's interesting.
So I think it's Station Fall minus in terms of weight. Like it's not completely out of the realm of Station Fall, but if this wasn't asymmetric, I think this would be fall way more on midweight. Like I think the fact that it's asymmetric makes it feel heavier, but each person's own game I don't think is like that heavy or that much to get through. But it would be great for us or groups that like games like us because it's like negotiation. Plus, you've got the economy. Plus, like, you can do some, not that we're, like, big into role play, but, like, it's just hilarious to see the capitalist player just, like, rolling in dough and, like, the working class player just trying to get some money for healthcare. Sure. And then the state player just trying to get, everybody's yelling at the state player to, like, hey, help me out here, and them trying. So it's, like, there's a lot of, like, dynamism in the game that I think would work for players that like the games that we sort of like. It might be a touch heavier than where our ideal game would land, but again, I don't think it's that heavy.
How do you respond to a BGG user who says it's fun if you like doing your taxes?
So, I mean, obviously, that goes sort of with the politics gripe that I might see people saying, like, I don't want to play a game of politics. I mean, the amount of calculation in the game is quite low. It's like when you're doing your taxes, which you are going to do in the game, it's like number of pawns times tax rate. That's all it is. Like whatever the tax rate slider is at times number of pawns. It like doesn't get much more complicated than that. So if you're worried about a spreadsheety game, that's not this. This game is not calculate the tax rate and like whatever. Although it is funny because like there are 3 different types of taxes that you have to consider depending on what player you are. Like if you're the working class player, all you do is income tax. But if you're like into the businesses, like if you're a capitalist or the middle class, you do have to pay like a business tax or a capital gain tax. So it's like a different sort of thing. But again, it's all very easy to calculate.
So we're talking about interactive asymmetry where you could be Cthulhu, emerge out of the ocean and crush your enemies to death. And you're telling me that you recommend we play a game with 3 different kinds of taxations?
100%. I mean, modern day Cthulhu is the U.S. tax system. I think that's a perfect analogy.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that. That's true.
Yeah, it comes out of nowhere and just knocks you out.
Quick question, Mark. How long did your game take? Because I've definitely heard people say that this can be crazy long.
Yeah, so our game took a little bit over 3 hours. And that was the first game consulting thing. And like, look, it's always so easy to say after your first game, you'll be able to run it like real quick. And I do think that's the case here. I think you get it cut down to like 2.5 hours probably. But, you know, how many people out there like are going to play a game over and over again? I think if you're in that group where you think this is a game you play over and over again, then yeah, make that whole length of time even less of a hurdle for you. But even for people who are going to play this game once in a blue moon, if you're going in looking for a heavy game, I think 3.5 hours for a game that as you're playing it, I think flies by, and which is aided by the negotiation and again the dynamism of it. Like it's a game that doesn't feel like 3.5 hours. Turns are quick. It's like play a card, do a thing. Play a card, do a thing. Goes around. It's not really slow, and again the interaction really helps that. So, I could see the first game lasting as long as 4 hours, but that would be, I think, quite slow. Quite slow.
Intriguing. Yeah, let's put this on the list of games that we have to play.
There you go.
That's how we get it done. Okay. What did we
having
decide?
An imaginary list that we never return back to.
Yeah, exactly. That we never actually get around to. Before we get on to the second half of the episode, just in the middle here, we wanted to talk about the draft that we did 2 weeks ago. We have the numbers. Everyone that voted, thank you so much. Thank you for coming down on the right side, as I won the draft.
Boo.
Neon, so you can only win so much, you just keep winning.
You guys gotta stop me at some point.
Okay, but can we
I
at
don't
least...
think I can. I just don't know. I just do not trust myself anymore at all.
You're just giving up, Mark?
You should be logging these, Mark. And we should be just saying out loud that I have hundreds more votes than Mark. No, I don't know if that's true.
I think that's absolutely true. I think there's no way that can't be true.
If anyone is interested, I received 46% of the vote. Kellen received 35% of the vote, and Mark
I got the rest.
19% of the vote.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off before I did the maths there.
After one day, amongst our most loyal listener base, amongst the smartest of the smarts, I was neck and neck and even ahead of you. And it wasn't until the filthy casuals who came in over, and I should be really clear
the way
because
I see it is that what I like to think about that is like the democratic process just kind of winning out over time. Yeah, exactly.
A hard-won vote here and there over the weekend.
Yeah. You can't count your victories just based on the people that are first in line.
I see. Well, we promised $100. Despite Mark's objections, but he doesn't make the rules because Mr. 19.1%, the winner of the $100, your email address starts with F, ends with more@gmail.com. And we
Who do they
will
vote for?
What?
Are we allowed to disclose that? Because I don't know.
They voted for... Actually, I think they voted for you.
See?
They
All right.
voted for
Well,
you,
there you go.
Nova.
Vote for me, get money. Vote for me at least to get money.
All right,
in your own
have to
self-interest.
redo. We'll have to redo that. But congratulations on your $100 board game gift card to any retailer of your choice. We love doing these drafts. If you have an idea for a draft, feel free to hit us up. And that was a fun one. It was a little weirder than we normally go.
Definitely.
I think, on the draft.
I heard a lot of people in response say that it was one of the best parameters to build a draft around. So I like the idea of making them not purely based on, just here are the best 5 games from this list. The constraints made it a very interesting thing to consider, which I thought was cool. But yeah, thank you all for voting. Love doing the draft. I'm glad we're going to have this back in the rotation. Let's get on to the feature topic, or at least one of 2 feature topics for this episode. 2 quick questions from listeners. The first question comes from, I'm going to say Jaren. I apologize if that's completely wrong. They say, the best or most problem. A common complaint of the Oscars for best editing is that the award usually goes to the movie with the most editing rather than the movie with the best. I think that this problem is something we are seeing more and more in modern board games. How can we tell if a game is the best version of itself or just the most version of itself? So this is, I feel like, something that we talked about a fair bit, which is I think this idea that we sometimes hold to, and I think there are good exceptions to this. I think, funnily enough, Hegemony is maybe a good example of this, where the simplest version of the game is often the one that we are most inclined to say is the better version of the game. I think there are obviously very big exceptions to that. But how do you guys feel about this in general? The idea of what is the trade-off for more versus less to you?
I mean, I'm immediately drawn to sort of the comparison to like, what is the best art in board games? And then it goes to like the flashiest Kickstarter that has all the like crazy bling in it. And it's not necessarily the thing that is like most thematically realized or the thing that like exists together as this cohesive product vision, but it's in fact just the loudest or the most ostentatious like version of that thing, similar to the reference of editing. Like if you notice it, maybe it's not the best editing, maybe that's what you should consider. So I think that's a fun framework. I'm not sure that I can think of a game off the top of my head that like articulates that well.
It's interesting how it's a function of how the board game hobby has grown over the years. Like I remember the excitement that frankly that you guys whipped up in me when like those old CMON Kickstarters were coming out. And like the excitement for Rising Sun and all that stuff. And honestly, when games were coming out that were like super lavish and had all these things to it, all this bling, like it was honestly great. It's great when it felt like special. But now the fact that every Kickstarter or every new game has to be loaded with stuff has pushed things the other way. But I still think that those first games were special, did feel special. And it's hard to figure out what to even want as a result of like these games being overproduced or, having a ton of modules or, expansions or stuff like that. We will often say, and I think fairly, like, oh, we just want to play the base. Like, just tell us what the base, or tell us what the best version of the game is and just let us play that. And that, again, that's true. And that's also a function of like where we are now. But I kind of wish, and it's still true in some cases, that we were in a situation where the blinginess or like the specialness of those really not overproduced but or well produced, I guess is a better term, could be more celebrated. Or it's just we're so awash in things that it's hard to feel the joy I think we should be feeling about those games that have the toy factor or have the expansion, stuff like that. I think there are exceptions, as Neil sort of mentioned. Hegemony is a game that is it's actually not super overproduced. There doesn't feel like there's a lot of fat to it.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there in terms of the game, though.
Right, which you could winnow down to like a more pure version, which I would think would be lacking. But there are games like a game that does spring to mind is a game that I've really liked again unexpectedly is the Marvel Champions game. Again, a game sort of conversely, whereas before I would be thrilled by the occasional big splashy Kickstarter, I never thought, on the other hand, that I would be a fan of Marvel Champions again because the IP doesn't necessarily work for me, and I played as a solo game. But I do find myself excited by the number of expansions and different heroes and stuff like that because of, I think, the care that is put into like making the different characters unique. So yeah, it's a difficult thing for me to consider because I do wish we were back in the days where the splashy game did get us excited rather than sort of like in a lot of cases bum us out.
Yeah, it is funny actually you mentioned that because I think it's been very telling that in recent years I don't do the all-ins on Kickstarters anymore. Honestly, one of my favorite things that happens these days is when you look at a Kickstarter for a game that you're excited about and there's one pledge level and it's just a box,
Yeah.
You don't even have to think about the idea of getting add-ons and expansions and things like that. I think Rebirth was maybe one recently where that was like that, and it was such a blessing to like not have to consider, do I want the 5 expansions that came with this? And you're right, there was a time where that was very exciting. And Rising Sun was like a really good example of that, where it kind of just felt like, CMON does that better than anyone. Like here is all of the stuff, you're going to want all of it. And that has not worked on me for a while now, but I do in equal measure miss that period of my time with a hobby where that was very exciting, and the idea of getting something that was that sort of lavish and big and just a big experience and that you couldn't recreate in any other way was very, very novel and cool. But yeah, I do think more often than not, I do just lean towards I would rather have the simplest version of this thing. And, I do think that there are, like we said, very notable exceptions. I think like 2 good examples of this for me, like my 2 favorite Uwe games are Patchwork and A Feast for Odin, right? Like those are on polar opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of just stuff. That is what's satisfying about A Feast for Odin for me, is like how much stuff there just is that you might not even engage with in a single game. And Patchwork is not to say that they're the same type of game at all, but Patchwork is the most streamlined version of 50 different polyomino games that Uwe has ever made. And that's what I love about it, is it's just the simplest, most devious version of that type of game without any of the extra craft.
I think buried in this question that like I'm actually more drawn to the other part of it, which is sort of like the direct comparison of like a showiness versus like what actually exists under the surface. And so like as it applies to board games, it's like, is this game the most replayable game because it has, 17 different decks of cards and expansions, but we sort of cite it as most replayable, but then what games actually are most replayable underneath that? So that's the comparison to sort of editing, or in this case, modular content or expansion content, where it's like, I think about the games that I've played the most, like Codenames or So Clover. And again, these are party games, but it doesn't always have to be. Like the idea that I would buy like an expansion box of codename words is like laughable. Like they're like that could expand the game somehow, and yet no one would like. I don't think people would cite that as most replayable. They would say, well, Dominion has it's on its 17th big box expansion. And I love Dominion for that, but I think there's something interesting about, and especially in a hobby where people are playing games 2 or 3 times and then moving on, there's sort of that, what sense do you get from this on first blush, and then what actually sticks around or what it's actually rooted in. I think those are like 2 different things. So I think this is a fun question. I feel unequipped to answer it tonight for some reason, but I like what it's raising.
I have one more quick example that I think I want to bring up for sure. I've not spoken about Frosthaven at like any length yet, despite the fact that I've now played a bunch of it. Or maybe I haven't, I'm forgetting. But anyway, but Frosthaven is an experience that as a campaign legacy game, the quote-unquote sequel to one of my favorite games ever, I am enjoying substantially less. And I think it is largely because of this addition of layers added to like the metagame, the stuff between the scenarios, that I just don't think is any good. A lot of the time it's just kind of there. It doesn't feel particularly inspired. It doesn't feel particularly well considered. And it just bloats out a game that is already, to some extent, already a very big experience. Like what Gloomhaven didn't need was more stuff layered onto it. It just needed to be the best possible version of a Gloomhaven sequel would have just been the same game, but with more interesting and more novel scenario design, which Frosthaven does do, but then it sort of takes 2 steps backwards by layering on systems that don't need to be there, in my opinion. So like it's hard. I spoke about this earlier with Sagrada Artisans. I think that there's another good example of a wrong way to do that style of campaign. But then at the same time, something like Undaunted Stalingrad totally worked for me, which is, effectively Undaunted with more systems that come in over time, but they knew how to hedge those within the context of the game and keep it relevant and interesting without it feeling excessive. And I do think it's hard to strike that balance. I think different people will have different facilities to appreciate that, or even just different preferences in that regard. But I largely just feel like I'd rather get to the version that is more refined.
As far as Kellen's, for lack of a better word, take on it, or the angle that he was talking about, I wonder when we talk about replayability and when we specifically like are trying to recommend a game for its replayability, I wonder if we're talking to different audiences. Does it even make sense to talk about a game's replayability? Of course it does in some sense, but like I think there's an audience that goes for games, and I don't think this is more right or more wrong, for the novelty of playing different games. And I think there's an audience that goes to games to like find a game that they'll play over and over again. And I think to talk about the replayability of a game, it just feels like half the population, or probably more than half the board game population, that like that sounds good, that becomes a plus in their heads to like, oh, this is more reason to get a game, when in fact it'll never like come to fruition. Like you're never gonna play a game like that, and it makes talking about replayability and this whole thing like so strange. Again, it just feels like we're talking to 2 discrete different groups of people, where like for one, replayability is like it becomes a negative, and a negative in practice, perhaps not in like theory, because in theory more replayability is always great. And then for another group, replayability may be like paramount, and it just like it becomes so difficult to talk about like the benefits of more expansions, the benefits of modules, because we're talking to 2 people who are going to take that again in practice in 2 starkly different ways.
Yeah, I think it's in some regard like we're evaluating marketing, right? Because that replayability is part of the marketing. And I think about this in the same thought as I think about like solo mode additions, where it's like, I can't imagine that the Dudes on a Map group that wants this game is also going to play the solo mode, and yet they add the solo mode because people say, oh, I really want a solo mode for this. And so it becomes like part of the sell sheet or part of what you read on the back of the box, even though like you want it to be able to go to 1,000 plays, even if you're not actually ever going to be the one to do that. But it sort of justifies the investment. Oh, I could play this by myself.
I mean, I don't really mind a solo mode being added on personally because I'm trying to like play more games solo. But when it feels tacked on, that feels terrible. But the worst offender for me is a game that has a co-op and competitive mode.
Yeah.
That is like, for me, like just hearing a game has those modes almost instantly knocks it off a game I want to play. If you can play this game competitively and cooperatively, it's like, what is this game? Like, I don't even want to approach it generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the same spirit of like if it's a negotiation game that you can play solo, you're a little like, what are you talking about? Or you know what I mean?
Agreed.
Like
For sure.
The solo mode for Cosmic Encounter is like sort of over my dead body, you know?
Yeah.
Though I'm sure it exists because they have the 2-player duel, so maybe there is a solo mode somewhere. Hope you love it, random person who's played it.
It's like a flowchart.
I know, yeah.
Each alien has their own flowchart. That'd be hilarious.
Okay, let's jump to our second question. This is a little quick question. Jordan wants to know, what game do you want people to play at your funeral? Jordan also says Mark might want to consider this more seriously than Kellen or Nealon.
What?
Oh, because you're closer to death.
Oh, is that what he's talking about? The fact that I'm going to be the one to most quickly get to my funeral?
You are maybe the healthiest. Like that.
Yeah,
that's my defensive
kind of thing I
view.
find funny about this,
Jordan. But obviously, yes, you will die before Nealon or I.
Well, yeah, I've got 10 years, right? We've already established
exactly.
that.
Less than
10 years the most, if I'm lucky. Well, okay, Jordan may be making a joke about the whole Biblios thing if he's not talking about the death thing. And that said, I would want people to be playing Biblios at my funeral. I mean, that has to be it. That has to be it. But what other game?
I think the one that jumped into my head is, and it's not even one that I feel like strongly associated with me, but it's the one I most strongly associate with some of the best fun we've had playing games together is Time's Up. Like, I think that's what I would want people to be doing, just like having the most fun in a social context.
You know what I want?
No, we got to talk about this. We're in the middle of the categories and like I'm just like bawling. Like, how am I going to be giving they're going to think it's like, or can we set the category to only like really sad things?
It said it's only things I loved.
Oh, well, that's that's even more sad. I'm going to get up there. It's in a flip. It's like, oh my God, remember that time. And now I'm trying to describe it to people while crying.
Perfect. This is all I wanted.
All the clues have to be Nealon based.
Yeah.
Like, Nealon didn't like this movie. It was a movie that we went to watch it. Yeah.
You're pointing at his gravestone to indicate him.
You know what I want? I want True Colors. Let's really get the tears going.
And there is a color. Someone has to have the color for Mark.
Yeah. That's right.
He may have died, but we wouldn't have want to sat on a plane next to him.
Exactly.
I wonder if there's a legit answer to this. Like, what?
I was thinking, like, I feel like for whatever reason, Fuji Flush comes to my mind, which is this like a stupid game, but that you do have to interact with the people that you're with, and like you're just playing with your cards. Like this actually could happen after a funeral, where it's like, what are we like, or like a Six Nymphs type sort of situation. I kind of associate this with like being at funerals when I was a child. And you kind of we would go off. I remember like catching frogs at a funeral while all the adults, because I didn't know the people as well. Or it was my aunts and uncles and cousins. And then all the kids would run off and still try to have fun, So I do think this could happen. Fuji Flush is my final answer. Choo right into the grave.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea of like people chanting to train.
Yeah, while I'm dead. It is weird, because I'm not there to enjoy it, and now I'm getting excited about playing Fuji Flush.
Okay, that is going to do it. Thank you both for those questions. As a reminder, if you want to send us future topic suggestions, you can do that at boardgamebarrage.com/topics. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you to Mark and Callan for being here. Thank you, as always, to Heart Society for our intro and outro music. What's in your mind, kid? Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.